The Voice in Speech and Song, Chapter 21. Illustrations, Symbols, and Figures of Speech. Well-chosen illustrations. Jesus was the greatest teacher the world ever knew. He presented truth in clear, forcible statements, and the illustrations he used were of the purest and highest order. He never mingled cheap symbols and figures with his divine instruction, or sought to pander to curiosity, or to gratify the class that will listen simply to be amused. He did not bring sacred truth down to the level of the common, and the comical illustrations that some ministers of the gospel use were never uttered by his divine lips. Christ did not employ illustrations that would create amusement and excite laughter. Nothing comical for mere attention. In the instruction of the divine teacher, there was no illustration used that would leave the least shadow upon the tablets of the soul. His words were of the purest and most elevated character. He never stooped to utter that which was comical, in order that he might attract an audience. Illustrations of common things. Jesus illustrated the glories of the kingdom of God by the use of the experiences and occurrences of earth. In compassionate love and tenderness, he cheered and comforted and instructed all who heard him, for grace was poured upon his lips that he might convey to men in the most attractive way the treasures of truth. Spiritual lessons from nature. The great teacher brought his hearers in contact with nature, that they might listen to the voice which speaks in all created things. And as their hearts became tender and their minds receptive, he helped them to interpret the spiritual teaching of the scenes upon which their eyes rested. The parables, by means of which he loved to teach lessons of truth, show how open his spirit was to the influences of nature, and how he delighted to gather the spiritual teaching from the surroundings of daily life. The birds of the air, the lilies of the field, the sower and the seed, the shepherd and the sheep. With these, Christ illustrated immortal truth. He drew illustrations also from the events of life, facts of experience familiar to the hearers. The leaven, the hid treasure, the pearl, the fishing net, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the houses on the rock and the sand. In his lessons, there was something to interest every mind, to appeal to every heart. Carefully chosen locales for discourses. The Redeemer of the world sought to make his lessons of instruction plain and simple, that all might comprehend them. He generally chose the open air for his discourses. No walls could enclose the multitude which followed him. But he had special reasons for resorting to the groves and the seaside to give his lessons of instruction. He could there have a commanding view of the landscape and make use of objects and scenes with which those in humble life were familiar, to illustrate the important truths he made known to them. With his lessons of instruction, he associated the works of God in nature. The birds which were caroling forth their songs without a care, the flowers of the valley glowing in their beauty, the lily that reposed in its purity upon the bosom of the lake, the lofty trees, the cultivated land, the waving grain, the barren soil, the tree that bore no fruit, the everlasting hills, the bubbling stream, the setting sun, tinting and gilding the heavens, all these he employed to impress his hearers with divine truth. He connected the works of God's finger in the heavens and upon the earth with the words of life he wished to impress upon their minds, that, as they should look upon the wonderful works of God in nature, his lessons might be fresh in their memories. From the known to the unknown. In his teaching, Christ drew his illustrations from the great treasury of household ties and affections, and from nature. The unknown was illustrated by the known. Sacred and divine truths by natural earthly things, with which the people were most familiar. These were the things that would speak to their hearts and make the deepest impression on their minds. The words of Christ placed the teachings of nature in a new aspect and made them a new revelation. He could speak of the things which his own hands had made, for they had qualities and properties that were peculiarly his own. In nature, as in the sacred pages of the Old Testament Scriptures, divine, momentous truths are revealed, and in his teaching, Jesus laid these open before the people, bound up with the beauty of natural things. Figures and symbols. For his own wise purpose, the Lord veils spiritual truths in figures and symbols. Through the use of figures of speech, the plainest and most telling rebuke was often given to his accusers and enemies, and they could find in his words no occasion to condemn him. In parables and comparisons, he found the best method of communicating divine truth. In simple language, using figures and illustrations drawn from the natural world, he opened spiritual truth to his hearers, and gave expression to precious principles that would have passed from their minds and left scarcely a trace had he not connected his words with stirring scenes of life, experience, or nature. In this way he called forth their interest, aroused inquiry, and when he had fully secured their attention, he decidedly impressed upon them the testimony of truth. In this way he was able to make sufficient impression upon the heart, so that afterward his hearers could look upon the thing with which he connected his lesson, and recall the words of the divine teacher.